It's a pleasure to come here and talk about this interesting concept of resources and borders. So in my experience in Central Asia, often we focus on the very local or national or regional context, but we don't pay much attention to what happens on resources and borders in a more globalized world. Since today we have great communications internationally, what happens in one country or one region often has implications in other parts of the globe. I think it's important so we have some awareness of what happens about resources and borders beyond Central Asia, because these are things that will also apply in Central Asia. So I want to start with a map of fossil fuel extraction. So different than the geographical maps we have that show borders, this is about the resources that are actually extracted by countries, and it looks much different than when we look at a normal map. But when we talk about resources, this is what we're really dealing with. And just think, do they reflect borders? And with the different sizes of each country's resource extraction, what does it mean for relations between states? We look at this, the green is China. So really it looks like the largest extractor in the world of resources, probably followed by the US and Russia in various ways. The Middle East, Saudi Arabia particularly has a large footprint, but also look how small South America, besides Venezuela, and Africa are in this diagram. So when we're talking about resources, this is what we're dealing with. And today I want to look at three examples. This comes from some of my research in other regions, the Gobi Desert between Mongolia and China, the Arabian Peninsula, and Central America. All three regions I never hear talked about here, nor do I hear this a more international perspective, but hopefully we can place Central Asia within a more global framework. Okay, so when we think of a transboundary extraction, here are some main points I think we should be aware of. See how they apply in case studies, but also how they might apply in our region here. We should think of environments, watersheds, minerals. They're very fixed goods, you might say, but borders are fluid, they're impermanent, they're influenced by human action, politics, conflict, etc. Because there are different nation states, there'll be different management regimes, different governance, different populations, not just in number of people, but types of people. Landscapes will differ. Here we have mountains, farmland. If we go to Kazakhstan, of course, vast deserts. And within the world, there are many different forms of conflict that we see happening, particularly that seem to relate to resource extraction. So there'll be some points in common, but of course differences between how nations and players, stakeholders within those nations engage with resources, the purpose of the resources, and how they function within society. So this falls on to the next point about themes of nationhood, indigeneity, that I'll talk about a little later, exploitation, and how resources channel into development. Also, I think we need to think of what's the role of corporations. These might be state corporations or private. Aid agencies, NGOs, have a big role in many parts of the world. The military, I never had spoken of, but actually they are some of the more powerful forces in many of these resource extraction dialogues. And overall, I think it highlights the challenges we face with natural resource management, not just here in Kyrgyzstan or Central Asia, but globally. Okay, the video's not working. Thank you. So I want to start in Arabia. So we know that Arabia is very important for oil and gas, but we don't talk about it very much. So here, this is a picture of the underground resources that we hear so much about. This is Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, Iraq, all these points there. Some in Oman, some as well in Yemen. Think about what we know about Yemen. It's in the middle of a civil war, much of it driven by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Iran that have different proxy fighters on the ground. So in this area of the world, we don't talk about Exxon or Total or Rosneft. We're talking about state corporations. Aramco, $2 trillion corporation, the most valuable corporation in the world in Saudi Arabia. Petroleum Development Oman, Qatar Petroleum, Kuwait Oil. So it's a very different dynamic than if we were to go to, let's say, the US or maybe Southeast Asia or other points where it'll be more international players, Western, Chinese, Russian involved in it. We have a different dynamic in the Middle East. Next. To talk about the borders and resources, here's a pipeline map of the Middle East, and a quick look tells you how diverse the pipeline network is, how many countries it impacts, and the many points there might be conflict or challenges when we're trying to access and transport oil and natural gas in the region. So we have it around the Gulf states, through the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, like that, to Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Turkey, and on to Europe. So very easy to imagine how any one state or any conflagration in that region could have an impact on supplies. And the main point here is this triangle, which is the Straits of Hormuz, where up to half the world's oil exports pass through this one narrow point. And on the point we have Iran on one side, Oman on the other side. And what we might need to know is that Oman has been the country that the Western powers, like the US, talk to the Iranians about oil, about development, about these things here. So it's the way that different countries are able to talk. So we see it maybe just as two nations, but actually it's a vital link in international diplomacy. And because of the tensions in the area, Oman, for example, spent $5 billion to build a pipeline from United Arab Emirates down to the coast. Because when there's conflict, like if we remember last fall, when half the Saudi oil capacity was attacked by drones, it was knocked out, how will oil get to China, Japan, Africa, et cetera? So Oman's idea is oil can now come down here and avoid this bottleneck. But this is all about politics and resources. Next. Thank you. So this is what it actually looks like if you look at the borders there. What we see is all these pipelines crisscrossing. So it's very unclear, and some of the borders in that region are not delineated. So what is Oman, what is Saudi Arabia is not fixed like we might have here. There's no river, there's no natural demarcation in the area. So we have this very mixed environment that shows how the resources between nations become quite complex. Next, please. So the other point I want to make in this area, this is the area that's the most militarized in the world. The two countries that spend the most on defense budgets are Oman at about 12% and Saudi Arabia over 10%. So who decides how things happen? It's the military with the autocratic leaders that are having the role. It's not economics, it's not development agencies, it's the military that has a key role in enforcing these rather arbitrary boundaries and protecting what they perceive as their valuable resources in the area. I mentioned we have the Yemen war going on now as we speak. We don't hear much about it. Saudi versus Iran, I mentioned the drones bombing the oil fields. We hear much about this in the West. We have Donald Trump, of course, who thinks that Iran is the great evil in the area and supports Saudi Arabia. You may not know, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates don't even have relations with Qatar. So we think they're all similar. They're Muslim countries, they're autocracies, they have oil and gas, they have vast wealth, but even within the Middle East, they're not talking. And Saudi Arabia actually wants to build a canal to make Qatar an island. So this seems quite far-fetched to me and not worth $1 billion. But in the internal politics, they're very different. I know Central Asians say this is a very contested political region. The Middle East and the Gulf may be more contested. And this is also without thinking of Israel and Israel versus the Palestinians, the Muslim world. So we have many conflicts in this part of the world. Next, please. Now, I want to move on to Central America. Quite a different dynamic. These are democracies. They're quite weak. They're in the shadow of the U.S. This is where a lot of migration goes to the U.S. that we also hear about with Trump's border wall. Many resources in the area, in these countries. This is a map of gold in the region, and most all countries have that. So they have their own version of challenges in Central America. This very well brings up this point of indigeneity. So groups that were original in this environment. So one definition, ethnic groups who are the original or earliest known inhabitants of an area, in contrast to groups that have settled, occupied, or colonized the area more recently. So we can think of the USA or Canada, where British and European colonists came, and the Indians in the US or First Nations in Canada, though they were there first, they were dispossessed of many of their rights and the land. So now there's great fight back from the indigenous communities for their rights to their land, both because of sacred sites and geography, but also they should have some benefit from the resources on their homelands. So, the United Nations, they emphasize the rights of indigenous people to strengthen their own institutions, cultures, and traditions, use of land, pursue development in their own way. In the U.S., there's 533 Indian reservations where they have a different set of laws than the U.S. as a whole. So the indigenous people can drive much of the debate in several parts of the world. In Central America, in the map, it's not a very large area. There's 52 tribes that live in that area. So if you're trying to mine or extract resources, you have all these other non-governmental stakeholders that have much say and impact. So this is an example of a pipeline going through Central America. Mexico has much oil. It goes both ways in this part of the world. Next. And this is the environment. It's not like the sand in the desert. It's not easy to construct these pipelines over mountains and through jungle. So we have a different, when they go in and start and construct these also infect the indigenous people. It's not the European descendants that are living in these areas, it's the indigenous people in Central America. And this is particularly resonant to some research I was doing last year. There's a group, the Chorti Maya people, one of the 52 tribes. They're having very contentious relations with gold mining in the area, and this is particularly with a Canadian-owned mine. And what they're doing here is, this is where pyramids originated in the Americas, so their protest is mirroring their pyramids from their own culture and history to try and draw attention to the inequality and the exploitation going on in the region. And they have this, we are defending the land with our blood. So actually, Central America is the most dangerous place to be an environmental activist. And 2/3 of the people that have been killed about the environment are from Central and Latin America. And so this is a site where they're saying, you know, we want dignity for Santa Rosa, their community. And next, I was to go there last September, but because of a cross-border conflict between the Chorti Maya and the mines that straddle the border. An activist was killed recently that we were supposed to meet with, and his tribe, and so everything was canceled because it was going to be too dangerous. So I know people say Central Asia's got some conflict, but actually it may be much worse in other parts of the world. So next I want to move to Mongolia China, much closer to the Central Asian context. This just shows you many of the mines. The mine license is also given along the border with China, and the connectivity. Next. Whoa, back. Okay, there's one before that. Okay, well, okay. Oh well, back one. All right, so in Mongolia, like Kyrgyzstan, there's the environmental the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I know it's based in the Ministry of Subsoils here. It's also in Mongolia at the Ministry of Mining. So these provide some standards for how the local communities and environment should be dealt with. And also there's the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank has standards on indigeneity, on community, on cultural heritage, et cetera, land use. So there are frameworks within which to work and have development. I guess if you can go back, I think I missed, yeah, back. Okay, and in this area, the big mine that we all hear about, and many people in Kyrgyzstan have talked about this, Oyu-Tolgoi, $12 billion. And in this environment, the herders were able to raise a complaint of impacts on land and water, indigenous culture, and livelihoods in southern Mongolia. Here's the site. It's only 80 kilometers from the Chinese border. And yes, all the minerals are exported to China. So that's where we get this strong trans-border angle. Through NGOs, Mongolian NGOs, working with international NGOs, they were able to bring this complaint to the IFC that is guaranteeing loans for the mine development. So through that process, they were able to get attention where, okay, next, one more, okay, where they developed this tripartite council where we see the miners, the local government, and the herders actually sit together in a room, and over time, over a period of years, they were able to reach a settlement that the mine gave some benefits to the community. The community could accept the mine as having ability to exist there, and some revenue, some taxes were actually paid to the local community to develop schools, roads, water, some basic infrastructure like that. Equally, there were jobs for the Mongolians, which I know here is also a big issue, who gets the jobs. So this is a positive story, but of course it has other impacts being right on the Chinese border. Thank you. This is the line last spring, 80 kilometers long, and it's taking the minerals to China. And China has the border open certain hours, and the line is so long, it takes days to get through, so that the road actually becomes like a village. There's food vans driving up and down, other things as well. But what it also does is cut off the environment. So in this area, Mongolians are herders. The animals cannot cross the road because of all the trucks. So then mining, just the delivery of the minerals, also has great impact on the local community and their livelihoods. Now that's today in 2019. If we go to 2020, this is what the border with China looks like now, today, this week. No cars are crossing because of coronavirus. So no one's mentioned anything like that, but it may not just be politics that affect borders. Here, because of disease, the border is closed between the two countries. That means there'll be no more extraction going on in Mongolia. They're not able to deliver it. What does that mean for jobs, for the economy? But also Mongolia, where will they get their food from? I mean, they have animals there, fruit, vegetables, et cetera, come from China. So the border is much more than just a transit point where you might pay some tax. It's also key to livelihoods that are developed in our very connected world. Thank you. And so to kind of wrap up, here's gold. Look at where the gold deposits are in the world. Think of the country borders. How many fit within a border? If we have a large country like Canada, most of their gold will be within Canada. But in Africa, we see across many, many nations. So how do we resolve these issues between different states, different cultures, different languages, different forms of government? One more. And this is shale. So shale is the new big thing for petroleum, for oil. The U.S. has really pushed this. Trump has really supported this, and now the U.S. actually is the biggest oil producer in the world. That's quite a surprise, but it's driven by shale. And if we look at, back one. Yeah. If we look at the shale deposits, like this in China, it's within China, but in Europe, Eastern Europe, South America, parts of Africa, they're in many different countries. So how are you going to deal with this shale and extract it without dealing with these resource border issues? And a last slide. If we go back to our first map, think of where the resources are being extracted, think of the borders of countries, where the shale, where the gold is, where the oil is, and we see why there can be many challenges. Usually here we talk more about the political. It might be economic. It's corporations. Are they state-owned? Are they private? For example, in the Middle East, we see war and conflict in many different fronts that affect the ability for resources and ideas to cross borders. Indigeneity is particularly strong in Latin America and parts of Africa. And two things we never talk about, I never hear about resources. What will climate change impact be in the coming future? For resources, you need water, you need to extract. Will there be enough water? What about the land quality? What about the livelihoods for the people near the mines? And today it's very interesting to be in Central Asia when we have this epidemic next door in China. What will coronavirus do for resources, extraction, trade, and acceptance of each other? Already many things are happening to Chinese people in different countries of the world. It's unfortunate that a virus can have such impact, but we need to recognize the reality of the world and hopefully deal with these to have better resource extraction crossing borders globally. Thank you.